got the list? Thank you. Just 6 o'clock, I'll declare the meeting open and begin by acknowledging the traditional owners. Gala Kadich Wajuk Mort Kayan Kadak Nija Walilap Buja, where Jinang Wajuk Kadijin, where Nitying Bula Yeye. We acknowledge the Wajuk people as the traditional owners of the greater Fremantle Walyalup area, and we recognise that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still important today. Attendance, apologies and leaves of absence. We have an apology from the Mayor, from Councillor Groom and Councillor Graham, and Councillor Committe is unable to deputise as he has a funeral today. So we're down to 5 people. Any disclosure of interest by members? Councillor Lang. Which one? Item 6. Okay, so proximity interest. Councillor Sullivan, same?
It's the same. It's actually a proximity issue and also a financial issue, because there is a adverse possession claim, which means there would be a financial relationship with the adjoining property, the applicant. So,
okay, so Councillor
I think
Sullivan.
I'll declare both. Councillor Lang will probably need to do the same.
And you want to do the same, Councillor Lang? Yep, so that's item 6. Any previous questions on notice? I don't believe there are any. Public question time. This is for items which are not on tonight's agenda. If anybody has questions of a general nature not on tonight's agenda, I'll do that now. Petitions, deputations, presentations by members, confirmation of minutes. I move the minutes of the meeting dated 2nd of November 2022. Is there a seconder? Councillor Lang, thank you. All those in favour? That's unanimous. Any elected member communications? So we'll move on to the items on the agenda. I will take the items in agenda order, but bring to the front the ones where there is someone to speak. So we've got those separated out. The first item is 5 Manning Street, a deferred item. It's recommended for approval, and to speak against the officer's recommendation is Martin Cabot. Just remind people you have 3 minutes to speak. You'll hear an alarm about 20 seconds before the end. We'd ask you to wrap up at that point. You are being recorded, but you're not visible in the camera. So your voice is available on the recording and to people outside the building, but your face is not recorded. Thank you, Mr. Cabot.
Okay, I'm Martin Cabot, owner-occupier of number 7 Manning Street on the southern side of number 5. Been living at number 7 for about 5 years, owner for about 7, with my wife and 2 young kids. I'm opposing the proposal on a couple of grounds, essentially relating to the bulk of the building, open space and overshadowing. I believe that the height of the building, it's approaching, by the time it gets to the back of the building from natural ground level, sort of approaching 3 stories, with the optional basement at the ground level, is excessive, and perhaps should follow the slope of the natural ground more closely. to minimise impact. An example that at number 3, there's they've done an extension in the last few years with a similar extent to the west, but it's been kept much lower. I'm not suggesting it needs to be as minimal as that, but it's sort of an example where they've fit in with the surroundings and minimise impact for the neighbours. Currently the backyards in most of the street on our side are all very open and allows the narrow blocks to feel much larger. And I think designing the building to match the contour would improve, without much impact to the occupants, would have minimal impact for them and improve things generally for the neighbours. Regarding the overshadowing, the design, I think, has been sort of cleverly designed to minimise the shadow thrown at midday on the winter's day. But at other times, the overshadowing it extends. It's much greater pretty quickly, which I think, given that there's discretion given to the overshadowing, that should be considered. For example, our garden, like a substantial portion of our garden, will be in full shade for most of the winter. And also the proposed design includes a terrace on the upper floor, which is the only access to the kitchen, and I think that's likely to be desirable to enclose further, increase overshadowing in the future. And on a heritage has been another point that's been this is the reason why the building has been proposed to be moved back. And I think there could be some compromise by, without impacting the streetscape, the building could be up to the ridge line of the existing building without impacting the streetscape, but improving the amenity for the neighbours, reducing overshadowing.
Close, please.
That's I believe a better design that follows the contours better with the slope of the land, with some compromise from heritage, we could get a better result for everyone involved.
Thank you. Any questions from the neighbour? Okay, thank you. Jeremy Carter, you're the applicant, presumably, or?
Thank you. Jeremy Carter. So we are at number 5 Manning Street. We're here to support our proposal and agree with officers' recommendations and conditions. We've made significant changes since our initial proposal to accommodate council's recommendations, the neighbours' concerns and heritage. Our aim is to create a family home within walking distance to schools and amenities of Fremantle, with a glimpse of the Indian Ocean. Due to heritage value, we have pushed the development back and therefore reduced overshadow, bulk and scale. Rooms are not excessive in size, and the overshadow has been broken up by the balcony in the middle, reducing overshadowing and breaking up the form to create an attractive building. It's a difficult site to keep within council's regs, as it's not a full suburban block. The overlooking is mostly over western rooftops. On our street, there are a number of examples that have renovated to take in the western outlook. We're only asking for marginally over. We are now only marginally over variations, and hope that you accept what the planning officer has recommended. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from the applicant? I'll move the officer's recommendation, which is for approval. Is there a seconder? Councillor Sullivan. I'll just, a couple of points in response to some of the neighbours' comments. I'll just ask the officer to verify this, but the open deck area cannot be covered up without a further application. That's correct, isn't it?
Through you, Chair, yes, that is correct. It would alter the overshadowing calculation, which is a variation. So if they further increase that, a new proposal would need to come to us for approval.
Any discussion? Just for the benefit of members of the gallery, we need 5 people to vote in favour of something to make a decision tonight, and since we're 5 instead of 7, that means every vote has to be unanimous or it has to go to council. So we'll see how we go. But that's the rules of delegation. Now we need to have 5 votes to make a decision. So anybody ready to vote? I'll see all those in favour.
Sorry, I was going to say something, if that's okay. I just wanted to acknowledge that development in these sort of areas, particularly where you have a hill town sort of feel, where there is a potential view and the like, they're always challenging, and we do have to, I guess, acknowledge that most applicants sooner or later want to take advantage of that, and that always causes a little bit of trouble with height. But as the person who was particularly concerned about the previous application, I do commend the extent to which the applicant has gone to virtually redesign their entire approach so that it deals with the heritage precinct. It's a really important heritage precinct, and the response has been excellent. The scale is actually quite modest. If you look at their floor to ceiling heights, and particularly the upper floor pitching plate height and everything, they have gone a lot further than we've seen a lot of other applicants go in similar situations. And I think they should be commended for doing that. It's not without its impacts. There's almost never going to be a development in that area any longer that won't have impacts. But the ones in this instance, I think, on balance, are supportable.
Yeah, I just wanted to make similar comments to which Councillor Sullivan jumped in front of me and made. The other proposal was absolutely unsupportable, but it is refreshing to see an applicant come through and make such significant changes, even though it is still slightly over. Drastic changes here, I hope, can make the neighbour on the southern side reduce the shadow and any impact on amenity or life that you've got on that side. And it is difficult. I have a house similar to this, and there are extensions that get put up, and there are shadowing. So I acknowledge that it is, and particularly with your location, given the topography change from the top of the street to the bottom, it is a difficult site. So just wanted to commend the applicant for putting in a stronger effort to really reduce the overshadowing.
Any further discussion? Okay, we'll move to a vote. All those in favour of the offer recommendation for approval? Okay, that's unanimous, so that is a decision tonight. You can talk to the officers tomorrow about the next step. Item 2 is 8 Hickory Street, a 2-storey additions and alterations, and that's recommended for refusal. I've got Peter Merger, is it? To speak against the officer's recommendation.
Chair, before
3
I begin,
minutes.
I was hoping to be able to distribute just a quick plan to the councillors, if that's okay. Is that through the...
Is this the same as you sent out in the
In the email that came from the owner of the property, Mr. Ian Blinge, yes.
Yeah. So that's Mr. Bellinge, is it?
Yes.
So we've all seen your email. Thank you. Yeah.
Yes. Just in case for those that may not have had a copy or didn't see the email, I thought I'd print one off and you can refer to it. If I'm okay to start. So good evening, Chair and Councillors. My name is Peter Merger from Urbanista Town Planning. I'm speaking in relation to the item for 8 Hickory Street in South Fremantle. I represent the owners of the property, Mr. Ian and Mrs. Jana Blinge, and I'll be speaking against the officer recommendation and in support of the development application. So number 8 Hickory Street currently comprises a single-storey dwelling with 3 small bedrooms, a living area, a kitchen and bathroom, all contained within a very tight space. The idea behind the proposed extensions is to provide more room for the family to grow by relocating the bedrooms to a second storey and to provide separate living rooms on the ground and second stories for their family and guests. A new partially covered rooftop terrace is also proposed above the second storey, which will be adequately set back from all lot boundaries and provide a space for barbecue and outlook to the ocean. Should they proceed in their current form, the extensions would be sympathetic to the current style of the home, as well as to other houses in the local area. Notwithstanding, the application is recommended for refusal by the city's officers. The report provides two reasons for refusal, which primarily relate to building height and overshadowing. In relation to the concerns relating to building height and overshadowing, I believe that they are adequately addressed as follows. The variations are only generally minor in nature with respect to overshadowing, with respect to overshadowing, almost unavoidable. This is due to the orientation of the lots along Hickory Street and their small size. We currently overshadow the adjoining property by 34%, which is 9% greater than the deemed to comply requirement of 25%. However, the second story and roof terrace have been carefully designed so that they sit away from the southern lot boundary. With respect to the roof terrace, it is proposed to be set back more than 11 metres from the primary street, 8.4 metres from the rear, and 4.6 to the neighbour to the south. By providing such significant lot boundary setbacks, we ensure that adequate separation is provided with the aim of achieving minimal impact on the neighbouring property in terms of bulk, scale, and overshadowing. As a comparison, we've prepared an alternative plan, which I've distributed, showing a compliant two-storey development proposal on the site, and it has come back with an overshadowing calculation of 44%. This shows that a carefully designed three-storey development can be much less impactful on the neighbour than a compliant two-storey proposal that is situated close to the boundary. Notwithstanding, overshadowing of the adjoining property falls on an area of the site on the adjoining property that includes a carport and which is unlikely to be built on due to the location of an easement that runs along that section of the property. On the proposed issue of building height, the variation occurs in one area of the site near our northern neighbour. This neighbour has offered their support for the proposal and provided a letter of no objection. In this instance, due to the area of the site where the building height variation occurs, it does not contribute to the overshadowing or any adverse impact on the southern neighbour's property. Overall, the proposal largely complies with the planning framework, and the form of development is considered to be entirely appropriate within the context and character of the area. Based on that, we respectfully ask that the Planning Committee consider an alternative recommendation and approve the proposed development. I guess should the Planning Committee be of the view that more can be done to improve the extent of the variations, then I respectfully ask that it defer the application to the next available council meeting to provide the owner with more time to make some changes and liaise with the adjoining owner. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any questions of the representative of the applicant, Councillor Lang?
Just a quick one. Did you mention that the neighbour on the southern boundaries signed a letter saying they support this design?
On the northern side, he has. Yeah, on the northern side. Yeah.
Okay, right.
Yeah. Any further questions? Okay, thank you. So I'll move the recommendation, which is for refusal. Is there a seconder? Councillor Archibald. Any discussion? Councillor Law.
Can I ask a question of staff? This material that we were given about the fully compliant building exceeding the overshadowing requirements, because they would exceed the overshadowing, would that make it non-compliant, or would that be allowed to be built? Something like that, I guess.
The way the AR codes work is you need to comply with each provision. You do have scenarios, particularly in infill environments, where you can build a property that does comply with something like building height, but doesn't comply with overshadowing. So the house could have a smaller footprint, for example, be the same height and throw less shadow on the southern property. So it might be deemed to comply under building height, which would remove the reason for refusal being building height, but overshadowing, if it still affected areas that didn't meet the design principles, would still potentially be a reason for refusal. But without seeing a full set of plans, and I will admit, this is the first time I have seen this diagram.
I might just pursue that question a little bit. Would it be understandable that the applicant would be arguing that if they built a building that was compliant with the heights, it could, in theory, cast a bigger shadow than a building that isn't compliant with the heights and cast potentially a smaller shadow, in the sense that it's not necessarily the height that is the offending issue, it's the shadow that is the primary issue. Would that be a fair planning argument?
Yes, through you, Chair, it is, but also there's a little bit more that can be done. So a building could well be higher than what the R codes put in as a deemed to comply provision, but the footprint of the dwelling and the siting of those additions could be so that the southern property is less affected. So there are sometimes cases, and we get it quite often in Fremantle, where a really well designed, architecturally thought out property does exceed a lot of deemed to comply provisions, but it's actually a better outcome in terms of the amenity of the neighbour. So there is ways to get through that. The R codes are not perfect, but the consideration of a neighbouring property in this infill environment is something that council will need to think through.
So if I could ask a further question without being overly leading in a sense. The applicant is asking for the potential for a chance to redesign. Would it be fair to argue that the emphasis should be on the overshadowing rather than necessarily the issue of the upper floor, which is well set back?
Yes, that's correct. So one of the main reasons officers don't support the building height at present is because of the impact of the overshadowing on the neighbour. So it may well be that there is still a height discretion in terms of it not being deemed to comply that officers could support. But again, we'd need to see a design. But how it affects that southern neighbour in terms of overshadowing and what it shadows is probably the key issue for us.
So I'll just make a comment. If people are thinking of the possibility of a referral, I'll just make 2 points. We need to be very clear why we're referring it, what needs to change, and we don't need a unanimous vote. A majority is all that we need because we're not actually making a decision. So it can be a majority vote. If anyone wants to pursue that line. And for Councillor Lawver.
Yeah, I would be inclined to support that, especially given the applicant has indicated a willingness to reconsider that. And I think the overshadowing is the biggest issue, not necessarily the height. I mean, those two kind of go hand in hand in some regard, but that's up to the applicant to come back to us with what they're proposing. And as long as the overshadowing is the biggest issue for myself personally on this one. And as staff pointed out, the height is causing the overshadowing, but that may not necessarily be the entire problem. So if they're willing to come back with an alternate set of plans, I would be supportive of that, giving them the time to do so.
So we won't move that at this stage, but we can discuss it. Is there any further discussion of that possibility? Councillor Sullivan?
Look, I'm always keen to give an applicant an opportunity to do that. I mean, obviously, they could have done that as part of the original application, and they were probably given such advice from the planning staff. But it comes down to the decision-making time. That's for me. That's what needs to happen. The floor-to-floor heights and the design of the building looks like it could afford lower eaves height and sort of doing something creative in the southern facing upper story bedrooms such that they might have lower eaves or slightly smaller rooms or whatever. Clearly the impact is most important not at the front of the adjoining property but at the rear of the adjoining property. The way their property is structured, you're never not going to get in the shadow that falls on their roof because they've developed relatively closely to their northern boundary and with a sort of a large pergola roof covered area in a sense. But the reality is that it's still important that they perhaps get that sort of northeastern light. So the southeastern corner of the upper floor of this proposal is where all the action needs to happen. If there is something that the designers can do to significantly, it's not a couple of square meters of overshadowing here or there. It's a significant reduction that needs to be achieved. If there is a way of doing that, then I'm certainly not concerned about the exceeding height and the like. So that would be my focus, and I would I wouldn't support a refusal tonight. So I guess the referral makes more sense.
Any further discussion, Councillor Archibald?
I just wanted to ask a question because if in looking at this, the adjacent house to the south is, from what I can see on this particular drawing, it's set further to the west. Is there an opportunity for this particular proposal to actually do something similar so that it, I mean, I guess that the question is really where is the prime outdoor space of the adjacent property to the south, you know, so that would be obviously the key thing for the applicant to be considering. And you know, and how much room is there to move? Can the house be moved further to the north onto the boundary more, so it produces a lesser impact on the southern side? Can it be moved a bit further to the front if garden space to the rear of the adjacent property is kind of prime space? So I'm just sort of wondering what flexibility is there, because I do share the concern that while we're getting these larger buildings being proposed, that I think the onus is still on the people developing these properties to do their utmost to make sure that they don't impact on what small amount of outdoor space these properties have.
Through you, Chair, the difficulty the applicant may have is that they are retaining the existing house on site. So how that'll work with construction might be a little tricky for them to shift the upper floor. The streetscape does have properties that are further forward, so there may be an opportunity to vary the streetscape policy, but they're obviously then in danger of bringing in a new discretion that may not be supported as well. So I think there's probably a few complicating factors for the applicant, but something for them to consider certainly.
Any further discussion? Right, does anybody wish to move a referral? And I presume the main grounds would be overshadowing. You've got something ready. Would you like a sample?
Yeah, just a question. Would a referral or a deferral to the next planning committee be more appropriate rather than a referral to the next council meeting?
It's a standard form of words that we use. I'd like to just read that and see if you're happy with it, if you're happy to move it. So Councillor Lawver, you have to move that? Yeah, so it's moved by Councillor Lawver, seconder. Councillor Sullivan. Don't need to discuss that, I don't think. All those in favour? That's unanimous. So if you'd like to talk to the officers tomorrow about where to go next. Next item 3. 122A Atfield Street. Two-storey house recommended for approval. Speaking against the officer's recommendation is Rosalind Habishan, is it? Habishan. Sorry. Let's go for 3 minutes, starting now. Thank you.
Hello. So we have a conflict of interest here. On one hand, we've got someone who wants to build a dream house, and on the other hand, you've got us who wants to protect our property, the value and the amenity of it. So our main problem as the owners of 124 Atfield Street has been the height of the parapet wall. We note that the ground level of 122A has now been supposedly lowered, and the height of the parapet wall that can be seen from 124 will be 300 millimetres above the existing masonry wall. This needs to be checked because when we spoke to the architect, he said that the parapet wall would be 300 millimetres above the colour bond panels, which are in actual fact 140 millimetres above the masonry wall. So I have worry about some inconsistencies in this. In figure 5 of the council's submission, we note that there is supposedly a 0.63 setback proposed. This only really means that the roof will be flat from the parapet wall and then rise up. So there's no actual gap. So I'm not sure when a setback is a setback. We note the officer's recommendation number 6 that the parapet wall that we can see should have a clean finish, etc. I would suggest that should be included in what we think is an acceptable clean wall, because it could be painted purple but be clean. Figure 3 shows the area of 124 affected by 122A. Ironically, most of the area not affected, which is coloured green in Figure 3, is the sewer easement area. Note, for 122A, this area will be built over using piling. Our second main concern are the site works. We are extremely concerned that they are labelled as relatively minor. For example, the area to be excavated is the store, basement, cellar and pool cannot be considered minor. Firstly, although the original Whitehurst survey says on the 11th of the 11th 21 that the block soil is sand, many neighbours have commented through direct knowledge that there is caprock and limestone beneath the sand. Secondly, going by the measurements on the plans, the amount of sand and rock needed to be removed for the basement area in total is approximately 190 cubic square metres. That would need to be checked, but I've done the maths twice. This is equivalent in size to over 3 40-foot shipping containers. That is not minor. This work alone, including the piling at the back, will be extremely difficult with a high likelihood of damage to properties, as well as vibration, dust, noise for neighbours on both sides of the street. Sure, dilapidation reports are done, but who supervises these? Who checks them? Who makes sure that if there is damage, it is repaired properly?
Could I ask you to draw to a close, please? If you've got...
Pardon?
Could I ask you to draw to a close? Your time's up.
Okay.
Slightly just to
It's
a final
finished now.
sentence.
It's finished? Okay. So I can't say anything else?
One more sentence, yeah, one more.
One more sentence. It says that the driveway of the proposed 122A is acceptable because our driveways are of a similar nature. They're not. We have a single car garage. It's not a double garage. And the driveway entrance onto the road is 3 metres. It's not a big driveway. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions of the neighbour? The issues of the building and so on we'll discuss when we get into committee, but I'll ask the officers to comment on that. Daniel Lewis, you're the applicant or the applicant's representative. Okay, 3 minutes starting now. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening. Thank you for the opportunity to address you and support the officer's recommendation for approval for a single house development application at 122A Atfield Street in South Freo. My name is Daniel Lewis, planning consultant at Element, here speaking on behalf of Mr. Paul Penzabene, who unfortunately can't be here tonight, the landowner of lot 201 Atfield Street, South Freo, the subject site. My intent this evening is to provide some brief comments on the key elements of the proposal, seeking variation to the deemed to comply requirements of the R codes, as supported by the city's planning staff. Firstly, the primary street setback. The primary street setback variation proposed seeks to provide a built form consistent with the prevailing variations as constructed along Atfield Street and allowable within the city's local planning policy 2.9. The selected recycled brickwork framing for the garage and front landscaping design elements provide an interest and character to the streetscape without compromising access, landscaping and open space. We therefore support the design principle assessment and support the officer's recommendation to vary the primary street setback as proposed. Second, the southern boundary wall, which the neighbour has spoken on tonight. As recognised by the Council's Policy 2.4, there will always be an impact as a result of any two-storey development on a 10-metre wide east-west orientated property. We acknowledge that. The client and their architect has, and as you can see in the plans, worked very well to design a proposed house with complete regard to the neighbour to limit the perceived impact on the southern boundary and the southern neighbour by ensuring the second storey minimises overshadowing to meet the deemed to comply provisions of the R codes by sloping the upper level down to the south and shifting the mass of the building across to the northern boundary. We've also reduced the parapet wall height behind the garage to be only 300 mm above the existing colorbond fence as surveyed by a licensed surveyor, and also increased the setback as best we can by cranking the ground floor ceiling by 630 mm to reduce the wall height on the boundary and the perceived building bulk to the southern neighbour. We believe this is a great design outcome. Lot 201 has a frontage of 10.06 metres. And if our frontage was 60 mil narrower, the applicant could have constructed a 3.5 metre higher parapet wall for 2/3 the length of the balance of the lot boundary behind this front setback, meeting the deemed to comply provision of the R codes and the city's local planning policy. So for context, for the sake of 60 mil, there could have been a lot worse outcome and it would have met the deemed to comply and we wouldn't be here tonight. In this context, we consider the proposed design to have responded very well to the complex design challenges of a narrow lot, seeking to preserve and prevent any potential impacts on the southern neighbour. We therefore support the planning officer's recommendation to support this setback variation as meeting the design principles of the R codes. In closing, we support the officer's recommendation for approval as presented tonight and recommend this application to the planning committee for approval. Thank you.
Are there any questions of the applicant's representative? No, thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Go into committee. I'll move the officer's recommendation, which is for approval. Is there a seconder? Councillor Archibald, any discussion? Well, first of all, I'll just ask the officers to clarify. I think many of the issues raised by the neighbour are part of the building licence process rather than the development application process. Is that correct? The site works, the condition report and that kind of thing. Could you just clarify that?
Yes, that's correct. And as I understand it, the applicants actually offered up the ability to do a dilapidation report before construction. Things like construction noise are dealt with under separate acts that can be monitored, and if there are issues, our compliance team can investigate.
And is there an expectation that neighbour is consulted about the finish on their side of the wall? Is that, or is it just so long as it's an acceptable finish?
Yes, provided it's an acceptable finish in accordance with that condition.
Right. But obviously a sensible applicant would consult their neighbours, wouldn't they? Yes. Any further discussion? Councillor Lawler.
Oh, I was just going to ask a question, if I could.
Councillor Sullivan.
Would it be the case that the upper floor was set back from the street significantly to try and better comply with the 10-metre setback requirement? And I'm just sort of wondering from a planning perspective whether there's a balancing act between, on these narrow lots, getting eyes over the street by having an upper floor come forward when the other adjoining ones have, versus the upper floor trying to be set back as far as possible to meet that 10-metre rule, which is there for the majority of areas of South Fremantle, which is single story, but doesn't necessarily relate all that well to this area. So you may not know the design intent of them, but was that something that was given consideration? Because we're also confronted with the double garage and no building on the ground floor facing the street and a setback upper story.
Through the chair, you've pretty well got it on par there. It's the streetscape requirement. If it was set back to the full 10 metres, it would be a very different outcome for that garage, and it would be very difficult to support it against the design principles, which talk about the frontage of that house not being dominated by the garage. So by having the upper floor closer to where that garage sits, you actually create that streetscape presence for the house, and given there are other properties closer to the street, it sort of it is a tricky balancing act. It's a small lot and it's a large house. It would be quite a small house if someone were to comply with every provision. But yeah, in effect, it'd be very difficult to support that garage if you set everything back to the 10 metres, and you may well have a worse impact on overshadowing for the southern neighbour as well by pushing the whole upper floor back.
Councillor Lawler, you wish to speak?
Yeah, and just I had asked for a potential deferral to be drafted just in case the committee feels that's something that we may decide to do. Because for me, looking at this street, and if you look at the two properties immediately to the south, yes, they look a lot like this house that's being proposed. But even then, the garage on this one is just kind of setting a new standard for this entire street. Every other house is pretty much a little heritage cottage, you know, with their front. That's the only, the 1, 2 houses down, that's the only one that's like that. And so I kind of am concerned about the cumulative impact of having these 3 in a row, where they're at least 2 of the 3 are exceeding these widths, because the garages, the 5 meters is deemed to comply. They're asking for a significant increase, which is 6.5. The crossover is also a significant increase. 3.5 is deemed to comply, and they're asking for 4.5. So and I acknowledge it's a difficult and narrow site, but 65% of the frontage of this house is going to be a garage door. And I just really wonder if we could do better in this part of South Fremantle. And personally, as we talk about streetscapes, because that's kind of the heritage situation in South Fremantle, having 3 garage dominant houses in a row, if that might actually in a vacant lot again to the north, um, they could reasonably assume that they could do the same, and then we might reach a tipping point where that's now the new standard for the street, and would really take away from the streetscape that we're trying to protect with our heritage policy. So I have asked for a deferral to be drafted, just in the event that other members of the committee would like to see if we can't get a better non-garage dominated front to this house, and not create a potential situation where I'm fine with the height. I'm fine with a lot of the other discussions in this. I'm just really worried that we're creating a wall of garages in South Fremantle on this really narrow, small heritage street. So,
without moving that, we can discuss it if anyone else wishes to make comment on that or any other matter. So
we would need a second, or I would need to move it in a second or to debate.
I prefer not to move it just yet. We'll just see if there's anybody else wish to speak. Sullivan?
Thanks. While I don't disagree with some of the intent of what Councillor Lawver is saying, I think this one on balance is approvable. One of the things that I noticed immediately in looking at this narrow lot application is the extent to which it really doesn't feel like a 2-story house in any part of it. When you look at it from the southern elevation, it essentially looks like a 1-story house with a roof that just rakes up a fair bit and has a reasonable slope to it. But the applicants have gone to considerable effort compared to the vast majority of narrow lot developments that we see to deal with the overshadowing aspect. But it is disappointing that we have a double garage scenario. It's not the first one in that section of street. And Councillor Lawver is right, as we run the risk of inviting more of them, although the other lots are either wider from memory or so narrow that they're battling to fit a single garage in anyway, which is the laneway lot just to the north, I think it is. So my only, sort of concern, or the first thing I looked at is this is the sort of looks like the case where the setback policy has kind of worked against getting a small balcony coming forward towards the street to compensate for the lack of a room on the ground floor, which is does help in terms of activating the streetscape. So, but look, on balance, I think the officer's recommendation is right. That it meets the standards for an approval. But if it was referred, I wouldn't be seeking necessarily a complete redesign for a single garage, because what that will probably do is start pushing the house further back as well, and might end up causing more problems. I'd rather see dealing with the garage by actually bringing the front bedroom and or a balcony from the front bedroom forward architecturally somehow, so that it created a little bit more activation of the street.
Just check with the officers if if there was general support for that idea, could we approve this tonight and then leave it open to the applicant to come back for a modification to the plan? Or they wouldn't have to do complete new plans, or how would that work?
Through you, Chair, it would depend on what those changes were. More than likely, they'd probably need to lodge a variation application. May be able to be dealt with under delegation, but I'm doing a lot of speculating here and now. Changes to plans would usually need further approval.
Yeah, thanks. Any further discussion? Councillor Lorva?
You know, I guess if a deferral would be under consideration, I'd be willing to amend what's up there to not just solely have it rest on the garage width, but maybe change it to invite greater, what were your words, street activation, because that's, I guess, really is the if we have a wall of garages and then no one's out there enjoying their front area, that's really the concern. Um, you know, whether or not they deal with that by shortening the garage or however, and having more house at the front or a bigger balcony. Um, I just worry about the precedent of that. So that might be acceptable if, again, if the committee so thinks that that's something that we would like to do.
Right. Could I just get a sense from the other members of the committee if there's support for a referral, or if we'd rather do an approval? Just if I get some sense of that before we go any further down the referral track.
I think I'm more of the approval.
Right. If you want to move the referral, it doesn't sound like there's support for it. If you want to move it and test the water, you can do so. Yep.
I don't. I mean, there might be others ahead of me. Just briefly.
That's all right. Just
it was really just the whole complexity around the garage issue. And I mean, once upon a time, people would just build a simple carport and put two cars there and grow greenery all over it. And it really did have a much better softening of the street than having a very abrupt. But I do understand people now having a desire to have a fully enclosed carport. They're very garage. They're very useful. But of course, that was probably more the way people would have done it in the past when a lot of this street was developed. But so in the absence of that kind of thing happening, I feel that the application has done a reasonably job on a very tight block of dealing with a lot of the issues.
So Lang?
Yeah, I think Councillor Sullivan and Lorva put forward two very good points, and I'm looking further down the street at the precedent. I think it's 124, which is another two-story house with a double garage, which does start that argument Councillor Lorva was referring to. But I look at the design and the architecture of that house, and that, from what I can see in this Google Street image, hasn't really worked as hard architecturally to try and reduce overshadowing on the southern neighbour as what we're seeing on this new application. So I'm looking at where I'm going with that is the new application has worked extremely hard to find an outcome for our southern neighbour, to the point that the design of it is, as Sullivan said, it almost looks like a single-story property. So I'm landing in that on-balance position where I'm okay with the garage because they've worked so hard on the overshadowing, and then the other implications, if we do modify the garage, what does that mean for the rest of the house? So I think you get both arguments, but I'm leaning more towards approving it as it is at the moment.
Okay, so can I just say there is not support for the referral? We can take that away. Okay. Any further discussion?
I just want to add that I think there is a lot to like about this development, and you know, I'm not going to let something that may be marginally better stand in the way of a great proposal. So I hear what my colleagues are saying, and I will be supporting the officer's recommendation.
Any further discussion? No. I mean, I think the problem stemmed from the 10-metre block. As again, the 10-metre block gives us provides a lot of difficulties, and this solves it better than most. So the recommendation is for approval. Can I see all those in favour? That's unanimous. So that is a decision tonight. You can, and I think we'll leave it open to you whether you want to do a minor redesign and come back and talk to the officers about a balcony. Item 7 is Nicholas Crescent, alterations to driveway and front yard. The recommendation is for refusal, and Mr. Nick Main wishes to speak against that. If you'd like to come to the microphone, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you. So I'm the owner of the property, and I've been a resident in Hilton for some years now. Finally managed to make a purchase myself a few years back of this particular address. So why have I asked for a new crossover? In short, it's because I'm actually looking to move the parking area for the property, and I'm looking to do that for a number of reasons, but predominantly to make better use of the solar aspects available to me, and also to improve the access for my daughter. So the parking area is currently at the front of the house. So it's elevated about a metre above the street level, and the current only parking position you can have is actually parallel to the street. So this actually highlights the vehicles parked there, and makes that the visual focus when looking from the street. I'm conscious, obviously, that it is a heritage area, and that's not a particularly good heritage look. The parking area is also directly to the north of the house. So this hard stand actually creates a bit of a heat sink out the front. Stepping outside the front of my house when it's hot outside is very noticeable about the heat reflecting up off that area. Now, instead, I'd actually like to plant a mature shade tree in that position, which will actually assist with the passive cooling of the house and to help reduce my personal energy consumption, whilst also obviously providing a habitat for local bird life, etc. Of note, prior to the subdivision going through, looking at old maps of the area, there actually used to be a tree in the exact location I'm looking to put one now, but was actually removed to progress the subdivision. So I'd actually like to reinstate that. Personal level, though, as I briefly mentioned, relates more to my daughter. This is the most important part for me. The block is a block which slopes heavily from back to front, and from side to side, and in turn, obviously the driveway does the same. The current parking area, as it stands currently, actually then slopes on a sideways angle. Now, my daughter had a brain injury a number of years ago, and she has a 40% visual impairment to her left periphery. A number of times now, she's actually been struck by the car door closing on her unexpectedly. So, obviously I want to try and minimise future risks of that happening. So, I'm obviously conscious that the arcades required a right-of-way over the existing one, and the subdivision that was put through wasn't actually put through with any support specifically for the front property, as the owners of the rear property were the ones that did the subdivision, and as such there was no one advocating for the front. So why would I like you to use your discretion, which I believe is afforded under the local planning permission? Firstly, most importantly for me, obviously protect my daughter from any further injury. Secondly, the verge area is actually about 22 metres across. It's currently just grassed, undeveloped area. So a 3 metre wide crossover is barely 13–14% of that. The actual heritage policy for the area states that variations are permitted by the council, but landscaping should be used to soften the impact of the hard stand. So I'm more than willing to actually plant out the remaining verge area with water-wise native plants in line with any council recommendations. Some of my neighbours actually have done some excellent examples of this, which I can use for inspiration. Thirdly, there's precedence. The development to the rear property is currently into 2 houses, which is normally only be allowed for 1 under its zoning. So obviously the council has used already its discretion to step outside. And amongst the immediate neighbours, there are actually 8 properties out of 11 that have been subdivided. Now, a quick walk along my street shows that 6 of these have already got independent crossovers to the front and the rear properties. So the prevailing streetscape would suggest that independent crossovers are in place. So yeah, so summary, I'm just looking to dramatically increase the planting to the site, reduce injury, obviously risks for my daughter, and improve the visual amenity, which I think actually would be a better outcome than being forced to use the current setup.
Thank you. Any questions of the applicant? Councillor Lorber?
Thank you for coming, Nick. I was kind of wondering why this was before, and I appreciate you giving your reasons. And don't get me started about tree loss in Hilton. I'll keep you here all night. Or even maybe they need to update some of the local heritage policy. I'm a little struggling a little bit with it. I'm not sure how I'm going to go with it, but I just was wondering, have you considered leveling off the current parking area, and so that way it's not on a slope? Is that something that? Because I noticed that there's that retaining, kind of walkway that's been retained back. Like maybe you could even lower it or something. Is that something you've considered?
It's something I have considered. The difficulty I have, because I don't have any control over the slope and angle of the driveway itself. And given that to reverse out of the parking spaces, I'm already working on less than 90 degrees. By the time you start adjusting the slopes, from the driveway to the hard stand area, it's going to make it difficult to manoeuvre the vehicles safely. It's quite a tight spot, so yeah, that's yeah.
Just one other question, if I may. Is that you mentioned there were 2 houses built behind you or going to be built. Is that a social? Is that Homes West property?
It is, okay. Yeah, Department of Housing. So I think they had some special dispensation to do that, which is fine. I've got no problem with that at all. So,
Councillor Archibald.
Yes, I've just got a couple of questions. One is, I noticed that the area that you've allocated for the potential parking area is quite wide. It's wider than the driveway. Why is it such a big area in terms of width? Is it only intended for one vehicle? And then the other question I have is, if you like to answer that, I can't remember what my other question was.
okay, so when I originally started this, I started just as a application for a crossover, and that was then I was advised it would need to come through this channel. I wasn't expecting to have to do as much as I did in terms of plans, and so I drew things up very, very quickly. Nothing there specifically to scale. I just wanted a driveway with some parking on the left-hand side, and that was where my thoughts were at that point. So I'm open to making adjustments as needed.
So it is intended only for one vehicle?
The current parking I have is for 2 vehicles, or gives a space for 2. So I was thinking it probably 2, but one of the things I'd also consider is actually potential of making it tandem, so that one vehicle could be parked actually behind the front line of the property, as it would have been in the original property before it was subdivided.
Yep.
Just on the opposite side to where it would have been.
Okay. The other question was, how is what you're proposing going to make? I've just been looking at Google, looking at the house. I'm trying to understand why the proposed area is significantly better than the existing area.
From the two sides, one of which is obviously, if I'm going to be creating a new area, I'll make sure I create it perfectly flat and so on and so forth for safety for my daughter. So I'm looking to probably excavate an area out that is perfectly flat. Visually going forward, she's absolutely fine. It's a peripheral thing that she doesn't have that view. So as I say, when you're on a slope, the vehicle door closes, she doesn't see it coming. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is, I say, from the solar perspective. So the area I'm proposing is on the southeasterly side, northeasterly side, but easterly side of the property, where it's nice and shaded, out of the way. And that I felt was a better location, and then I can make better use of that northern area by putting a shade tree in, which would then actually benefit me in terms of protecting the house from that northerly sun and the heat that comes out of that hard stand area.
Any further questions? Okay, thank you. I'll move the officer's recommendation, which is for refusal. Is there a seconder? Councillor Lorber. If people are of a mind to approve it, what we'll have to do is vote against the refusal and then refer it to council and ask the officers to write an approval. So that's the process, I think would be correct. So we discuss the refusal first. Any discussion? Councillor Lorber.
Actually, I'm talking a lot tonight. Sorry, I wanted to keep this short. But you know, I'm really I sympathize with the applicant in wanting to create a space, and I suspect that as we only see more and more blocks chopped up in Hilton, we're going to run up against issues like this more and more. But you know, we do have the policy there, and I worry about if we start creating, you know, exemptions on one-offs, that will be inundated with asking for one-off exemptions to think something as significant as creating a crossover on a verge that, you know, the verges there are pretty good sized. And so I just, you know, while I appreciate there may be um, some urgency with the daughter's, you know, illness and stuff to try to get a solution that's better. I feel like in the Garden Suburb precinct that we may, if we're going to tackle this issue, we may want to approach it as a more as amending the policy itself, because the policy exists for a reason. And while I definitely don't agree with all of it, I think we could do some improvements. I think that, you know, starting to create additional, you know, crossovers is something that could have a huge impact, and not in a positive way. So at this point, I'm still leaning towards supporting the officer's recommendation, but with the caveat that maybe we could have a bigger discussion. So,
Any further comments? Councillor Lang.
I'm also concerned about the precedent this could set. I've had experience with some of these in City Ward as well. People wanting to shuffle around where the cars are parking and then creating extra crossover, which means we've got more vehicle access points going over footpaths, which is a danger, and we've got more concrete, which is the urban heat island effect. And so I lean more towards being concerned about the precedent, and I do sympathise with some of the issues you've raised, and there's logic behind a lot of that. By putting the shade tree in that northern point to create shade for your house, that makes sense. But I also wonder, could you still do that as well? Or could you create a new parking area that is better, marginally better than what you have, but still is safer, and you still get the shade, and then we don't have an extra crossover, and we're not setting that precedent, because I'm sure there'd be another 100 people picking the phone up in Hilton, applying for crossovers, and in Fremantle and right across City Fremantle, in fact, to put in an additional crossover on the ever increasing battle axe blocks that we're getting. So I'm leaning more towards the refusal for that reason, that we'd probably have the phone ringing hot for more people wanting crossovers.
Any further discussion? Councillor Sullivan.
Thanks. I hear what my colleagues are saying, and I guess I would normally agree entirely. I have a little bit of sympathy in circumstances which can require a little bit of compassion, but then there will be people out there in the Hilton community who will have argued that I showed them no compassion when they asked for a slightly higher fence, because they didn't have a back garden or the like. So there is that aspect of precedence and the like. On the flip side, it is a single crossover, and it's not right next to the next crossover, in the sense that you're not getting that cumulative impact of 3 crossovers in a row, which certainly exists a few doors down from here, where there is a similar block with a battle axe driveway and a crossover right next to it, and the adjoining crossover for the other houses right next to that. So it's not without its precedence. But the interesting thing about that house further down the road is it is compensated significantly by the way the landscape has been done well in that environment, and they've tried really hard with the landscaping. So part of me is, if there was a genuine sort of commitment to a landscaping, a significant landscaping improvement of both the verge and the front garden, which frankly is pretty barren in both regards, that would go a long way to convince me to accept the variation. Unfortunately, the applicant is basically um, trying to achieve this for his daughter, drawing his own plans, presumably, and the like. And it's not a high value project that's been put forward to us, because he's really just going to pay for a crossover and some paving, and then probably do the landscaping himself over time. So it is difficult to sort of, unlike the one down the road where someone has thrown lots and lots of money at it, and that's their business. They probably could do that. But it does sway the balancing act, I guess. So if there was a quality landscape proposal that potentially included an extra street tree and genuine sort of evidence of the types of tree that would be maintained in the front garden and the like, then I would be swayed, because those things can actually be considered as part of the planning approval and implemented as part of the planning approval and implemented for the life of the development, so that they can actually be tied to the relaxation in a way that other applicants that might come along, um, there would be a precedent set in that way to say, well, if you are going to get a slight variation from the policy, then we're going to expect a compensatory outcome that speaks to the Hilton Garden suburb principles. So that part of me wants to provide the applicant with that opportunity, but the problem is going to probably be is that you're talking about expenditure of perhaps design money and also implementation money. That's clearly up to the applicant to work out whether they can do that or not.
Again, just thinking about the procedure, we could refer it to council and ask for an alternative recommendation, but there wouldn't be time before this council meeting for the applicant to submit a revised plan. So I'll just check, could we do an approval with conditions on it about verge planting and things, or would that be asking for something that's not in being asked for?
Look, it would really depend on how far it went. You do have to sort of link the, I guess, the conditions to the proposal. I'd probably need to know more about what council was after in that regard. So it may be better to be debated a little bit.
Yeah, I'm not sure how we could come up with any recommendation that was clear. Has anybody any suggestions? I mean, it clearly is not going to be decided tonight, whatever. So it's going to council anyway, at least. Whether we try to get a better recommendation before council is really the issue. Somebody wish to speak? Councillor Archibald.
Sorry, I just I do have some sympathy for the applicant because of the specific circumstances. I am having had a fairly interesting debate last night about the issue of policy of the city not being upheld. I just had a look along this street, and there were three properties just within a very short distance, which all had two driveways crossing over to the properties because they'd been subdivided. I'm just wondering, given the circumstances, and this is not. I do support what the officers have said generally, but whether we should consider this tonight, and I mean perhaps we do need to revisit the Hilton policy, because it's better to get the policy right and suit the purpose than to just continue to make approvals as we go. So I feel that the applicant could potentially solve the problem of the levelling by, but I haven't seen the site, so it would be difficult to really say if they could. But on the other hand, I mean, we can't make an approval tonight because we don't have the information before us. But excuse me, if this could be perhaps deferred so that we could have a look at what is in the street and whether there is the potential to approve it, and then bring it back when it's appropriate.
I just check, the issue would be that we can't require work on the verge, can we, as part of a DA on the property owned by the applicant? So, but if the applicant offers that, is that different? If the applicant puts in a plan which includes that, rather than us requiring it. Is that different?
It is, but I'd still struggle to see how that linked with the policy. It would be a nice bonus, and I'm sure Graham's Parks team would love to see more trees in the verge, but it's a question of what's the planning merit to a condition. Um, that sort of thing can be negotiated through a crossover application potentially, but yeah, again, I can't see a clear link in varying the policy requirement because an applicant's putting forward additional works in the verge.
Councillor Sullivan.
Well, it sounds a little bit policy on the run, but there is a part of me that goes, well, if you're talking about more paving, and you're talking about trying to protect the garden suburb, then the extent of garden versus the extent of paving are clearly linked. The reason we don't want lots of crossovers is we don't want to lose the garden suburb feel. If additional landscaping is a way of softening the impact of additional paving, then the two are interconnected. And I acknowledge completely the manager's commentary, because it is actually normally a very difficult planning argument to tie particularly works not on the property to works on the verge. But of course, this includes paving in the property as well. And certainly the extent of paving and the need for extra concrete in the verge is a reasonable argument to say, well, the front garden's going to need to be, in other words, the private property garden is going to need to be uplifted to compensate for the extra concrete that we're going to get in the crossover as well. So there is an argument there that warrants that, and certainly you could, I think, tie that to the landscaping in the front garden. The extent to which that would be defendable is certainly a question, but I don't think, I think sometimes planning, we worry a little bit too much about how to defend something, and don't trust that in a majority of cases the goodwill of having to do something when you get something is normally upheld. So, in other words, an applicant, if they realise that they're gone beyond the policy that everyone's expected to comply with, that they go that extra yard to compensate as well. And the applicant has said that they would, that's what they would intend to do if they can. So.
It would be very difficult to get this to the next council meeting because the deadline for agenda items is tomorrow. So there seems to be some support for the proposal. Is there an option to approve it subject to revised plans, including improved landscaping or something to that effect?
You're probably trying to get me to draft an approval on the run here.
That it would be referred to council for an approval. That's the most we can do tonight. I think it will be to refer to council for an approval and give reason and outline why we're doing that. So I wouldn't be looking for an approval tonight.
Yep, I'll draft one tomorrow morning.
Not moving that at this stage, just suggesting it as a possible. So that would be referring it to council with a request for the officers to prepare an approval, including improved landscaping or something to that effect. So, Councillor Lawler.
Yeah, thank you. So there's a few things. So most of the subdivisions do share a driveway, and the really good ones actually 4 blocks share one driveway, but those are few and far between in Hilton. And this stretch of verge is already pretty well planted out with trees. So I just want to note that for the councillors that are here, it might be difficult to actually fit another good tree in this part of Hilton on the verge itself. So, well, I would, it's tough to consider something that's not before us now, such as a landscaping plan or something like that. I would be supportive if we wanted to give this some more time and see if more information could be put before us that could give us a reason to go against the officer's recommendation, I guess, and not. We don't necessarily have to refer it to council. We can defer it to the next planning committee. So that might be something that could give the applicant some time to, and I mean, plans don't have to be, they can be hand drawn or whatever. I mean, we can consider whatever is put before us. They don't have to necessarily invest a ton. I think, as Councillor Sullivan pointed out, just having an idea as to what is in the applicant's head might be a valuable thing. But as it stands personally, I mean, just with what's before us, and I'm intrigued by the conversation and the debate, which is why I'm thinking if we could wait until the next planning committee, um, that I'd be willing to go that far. But other than that, I think we've got to kind of stick with a policy that's there for good reason. So unless we can get a good reason to go against it, I would be inclined to support that. But I'm willing to give them time to bring that before us.
The director, would you like to make a comment?
Thank you through the chair. It just feels to me to get some clarity from this meeting, to give us some direction. We really need some guidance as to whether there's an appetite for a shift in policy, which we can take away and look at, or whether this particular application has specific aspects to it. And we've heard a few perhaps tonight, which would then enable or allows us to draft something for this location and this applicant in particular. And I think it would be good to know which way committee is really going on this, because I do think the policy was well intended. I do think there are some issues with its implementation, and as the applicant pointed out, there are a lot of examples out there which don't comply. So we can look at a policy shift, or we can just look at this specific one, and I think that would help us to draft what I think you're seeking.
Any further comments? We don't normally talk to the applicants during the meeting. I'm afraid we might have to in this case, but Councillor Archibald.
I just wanted to say, look, for me, the policy issue is a really big one. And I'm not saying tonight that I think we should review the policy. I think it would be good to go away and perhaps even during the break, have a good look at Hilton, because it is a long time ago when a lot of those policies were implemented. And I'm happy to deal with this tonight. Well, I'm happy to deal with this as we have to tonight, I mean, whichever form we do, just to deal with it as a specific case, and then to have a think about the policy issue over the break, and then maybe make a decision early next year.
Councillor Sullivan.
The Hilton policies have been reviewed quite extensively, quite regularly, and they're not, the ones that were written back in the 1990s, although they have a lot of reference to those. But every time we do the review at great pain, it inflames attitudes in the whole Hilton community about what should happen, and ultimately we come back to the core principles that are in our policies. The policies are not wrong. The officers were not wrong in recommending refusal. They were absolutely right. Sometimes there are, mitigating circumstances that will encourage you to do something that is different to policy. It is a policy after all. But in this instance, I wouldn't be supporting this unless I was convinced that there was a significant landscape proposal that was put in front of me that said, okay, we're putting in another crossover, but here's also what we're doing to compensate for that. Whether it might include, replacement of traditional fencing. It might include significant landscaping both in the front garden area and the verge. It's not just about trees. It is certainly about tree canopy, but there's also, the garden suburb has suffered over the years because of a drying climate and the lack of water and all of those sort of things. And so there are lots of things that can be done and have been done by other people in Hilton that compensate for less than perfect outcomes in the actual physical bricks and mortar of development. So if it wasn't a refusal, it would be a referral that was along the lines that we're not prepared to support a crossover because it's against policy, and they're not prepared to support it because there's no substantial mitigation of the impacts of allowing a second crossover. So, so in other words, it allowed the applicant to come back with mitigating, significant mitigating proposals, landscape proposals, to to mitigate the impact of the additional crossover. And that I would be prepared to consider, but I'm not prepared to consider changing the policy.
So that would be a referral to the next available planning committee or the next appropriate planning committee to.
It's basically saying we're not prepared,
And so we need to see if there's support for that. It's not been moved yet, but looks like we want to move that way. So do you want to prepare something? Does anybody wish to speak while we're waiting for that? Mr. Councillor Lorver?
Yeah, just a quick question for staff, or perhaps Chair. I understand the city is currently undergoing some review or planning to do some review of heritage policies across the city, and is Hilton on that list of policies for this potential upcoming review? Is that something that's already kind of in the works, I guess?
At this moment, I can't either through the chair. That we have got an extensive list of policy reviews. My understanding is Hilton is pretty much up to date.
Okay, so there's a referral on the screen. We'll just read that carefully before we move it.
Not changes, simply that it gives the applicant kind of time for two options. One would be, as Councillor Archibald was suggesting, it may well be cheaper and more efficient for the applicant to find a way to modify what currently exists. In other words, still using the side driveway, finding ways to overcome the difficulties that your daughter has with that. And the second would be to, unfortunately, significantly improve the quality of the application, the information in the application, to convince us that it was approvable because of the extent of mitigation. But of course, that might involve a whole bunch of cost as well. So it may well be cost of plans and also cost of implementation. At least you have the choices to go away and look at option A and option B for yourself and come back. And if you decide you want a decision on this, then that's what you would put forward. Or if you decide you want to change the existing scenario, then come back with that.
So I'm happy to move that referral that's on the screen. Is there a seconder? Councillor Lorver, any discussion? Councillor Archibald?
Just very briefly, I agree with Councillor Sullivan. I do urge the applicant, I think it might be much easier to just deal with improving what is there and putting in a good garden that would, it would reduce the heat on the house anyhow. But, there's lots of things you can do. I'm sure you're aware of all that stuff. So I think, to me, that would be the best outcome, that the applicant does simply resolve the issues on the site where the current car park is, put in some garden into the property. There's a lot of properties just along there that've got quite lovely gardens, and it must cool the whole area substantially. So I'm happy to support this. The applicant then has the option to look at the what's before him, but I would urge the applicant to seriously consider just modifying what is there.
Further discussion? Okay, so we'll move the referral. All those in favour? That's unanimous. Thank you. You can have a talk to the officers tomorrow. If you wanted to meet the next planning committee, which is the 11th of January, you'd need to move pretty quickly. The officer can advise you on that tomorrow. Thanks. Going 1, 2, 3, and 7. 6 as the expressions of interest. Can I just check? any other items people, so we need to do 6 separately. Any other items people would wish to speak on? We've got 8, 4, 5, 9, 11, 12, 13. I'll just give you a couple of minutes to have a look at that. Well, can I suggest I'll do item 6. Of course, we've got 2 people have to leave the room, and we've got an amendment. And then after item 6, we'll see what items people wish to speak on. Okay. So if you just think about that whilst we're doing item 6. So item 6 is the extension of time for the hotel.
Can I ask for a point of order? Do we still have quorum to make a decision on this? There's only 3 of us here.
Wait, it'll just refer to council. Okay, bring it back in. Can you ring the bell? No, I thought the mayor was going to be here, so I thought it would work. But, which is it? Oh, here. Is there any noise? You hear anything? So do we need to move that to go to council, or do we? We can't do anything with it. Can't do anything, so it just lapses, just sits there to go to council. Right. So could I get, so that's 6 as going to council. So we've got 4, 5, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. 12 and 13 have to go to council anyway. Councillor Sullivan has an amendment for 12, which can go to council, will be going to council anyway. So can I get an idea if people wish to speak on any of those items? Yeah. 10 seconds. We've never moved so many en bloc before in a planning meeting in my memory, but we're all happy to move that en bloc? Yes? 12 will be discussed at council, and the amendment will be ready by council. So that's well, if you want to pull it out, we can. Yeah.
I would like to pull 12 out because I won't be at council and it's very important to me.
So 12. So can we move the others? So we're looking at, if you can just double check this, 4, 5, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 13. Okay, moving all those in favour. Seconder, sorry. Councillor Lorver, all those in favour. That's unanimous. Thank you. So now just item 12 to deal with. I'll move the officer's recommendation. It's a report to, it has to go to council anyway. Is there a seconder? Councillor Lorver. Anybody wish to speak? So Councillor Sullivan has an amendment he wishes to move, which has been circulated, but late. So
yeah. No, and I apologise for that, Chair, and to the staff. It was one that I had forgotten that it was about to come forward, and I didn't manage to get to my agenda until Tuesday because I was away for the last 10 days and in meetings all Monday when I got back. So apologies for that, but it is a really, really important matter that the community have, not just our community, but the Hamilton Hill community that I've been very closely associated with over the years, have been pushing very hard, hoping eventually that a sound outcome will happen for the land both on the Fremantle side, i.e. Clontarf Hill, and also the land on the Coburn side, being part of the Hamilton Hill swamp area. I did bring along the document that I promised, and I would encourage, I'll leave it in the councillors' lounge. I would encourage all elected members to read it, and also relevant staff. I imagine some of the staff have seen this before, but of course it's got Simone McGurk's picture on the front. It's very rare that the local member has gone to such effort to listen to the community and actually get the Department of Planning, Land and Heritage to fund a $50,000 report about the issues that they've been basically banging on about for the last 30 years. So clearly, the community, it's not just me that's heard the community. Clearly, the community have been speaking to their local members for a very long time to get them to recognise and support. So there's been a bunch of things, we've seen it on Clontarf Hillside. We've seen it with the request for the horse heritage listings at a state level. We've seen it with the original development of the Green Plan. The Green Plan came out of the very conversation about Clontarf Hill. So for all of those reasons, I think we need to put our absolute best foot forward with this. And that's why, I thought the officer's recommendation was excellent. But I just wanted to go that sort of extra meter, I should say, to make sure that it represented the level of passion and the level of knowledge that's out there in the community about how important these spaces are regionally, to the state. Just the conversations if you do get a chance to read this, the conversations about the issue of the sorrow that this area represents to Aboriginal people, but also the importance that it represents to Aboriginal people in terms of the way the swamp was used, the way the hills were used, the way men's areas and women's areas were defined in that space. When we go to Clontarf Hill, anyone that's been there for the first time, on the south east side just goes, oh God, I didn't realise this was here. I didn't realise that we had this, amazing little remnant of the region tucked away in this hill, inconspicuously. And so for that reason, you actually warm to the place immediately. It has a presence. And it needs to be protected by including that space into the other areas, which we also know are magical. The Belia Regional Park, the Woodman Point Regional Park, which I sat on as an advisory member. These are critical to our community on the Fremantle side, being able to access all of these amazing facilities. So given that it was always going to need to be a council decision anyway, I respect the policy, but to be honest, it's actually more about policy is more about making sure that applicants don't get sort of side blinded by us making a decision which they didn't get to see any evidence that we might go that direction. Well, that's not really the case here. This is a case of the community have already expressed time and time again what they want in that area, and this is an amendment that actually simply seeks to put more flesh on the bones of that. And so I'm happy if it's moved by Councillor Archibald at full council. I just thought it would be better to try and present it now and get it into the public record well in advance, because that's actually a better process if you're talking about transparency, because the community always were going to get an opportunity to see that come up. It just means that anyone that's following this now will be able to see it now rather than on Tuesday, a day and a bit before the actual council meeting. So to me, this is more transparent. So.
Can I just check before you finish that we do have your amendment here? Although it was late, I think the officers just want a little bit of time to check it, and I think they've done that now. Yeah. So we can move that tonight if you would like to do that. I agree with you, better if it was in the agenda before we get to council. So if you'd like to move that.
Yeah, can I just check if it's by scrolling down whether it was the version 2 that had the reasons, or not that it matters? It's version 2. Oh yeah, excellent. Thank you.
So you're moving that?
So I'll move that.
And seconder, Councillor Archibald. Okay. Any further discussion? It's going to council anyway. So, yep, Councillor Archibald.
Sorry, just very briefly, I do support this, as I said by email. Excuse me, sorry about this coughing. And I do think it's really important for us to have that input into, although we've only got that tiny little corner, I would be very supportive of that being reserve and not urban, because it does have a few bits and pieces there, you know, vegetation there now. But it also helps connect the Clontarf Hill vegetation through to the Manning Ridge and Manning Park. And given what's happened with the thinking for Belia Regional Park, I think retaining any of these remnant bits of vegetation is really important. And so the other aspect of it too is Randwick Stables, where I'm aware that they're quite concerned about having urban encroach too closely to Randwick Stables. So I think anything that can ameliorate some of that would be really good. I might flag that I may put something up at council, because one of the, but I'll wait until I have a chat with planning staff and that, and we are kind of stretching the bow a bit here when we talk about the bit that goes to the east. But the Coburn Community Wildlife Group and others have been working very hard to try and get a little bit of connectivity across east-west, so that you know, black cockatoos in particular, but many other birds and that sort of thing, that start to have a bit of the ability to go across that area. And there have been a lot of people in the community who have been spending a lot of time trying to resurrect some of that. So I do take the, you know, the need for us to have some dialogue with the City of Coburn, but I'd be very hopeful that they would also be supportive. They you know, and that we might be able to help them in what they're trying to achieve there as well. So I'm very happy to second this.
And just for the record, I'll give reasons for accepting the late amendment, and they would be that it expands on the item rather than contradicts it, that it's not a decision being made tonight, and it allows this to go into the agenda for public consultation. So I don't want to set a precedent of accepting late amendments without good reason. Any further discussion? All ready to vote? All those in favour? So that goes to council. Thank you. Sorry, that's the amendment. And now the amended motion. All those in favour? That's unanimous. And that will go to council. Motions without notice. There are non-urgent business, non-late items, non-confidential business, none. So just prior to closing the meeting, I'd just like to thank the staff and the members of the committee. We've had a fairly arduous year. I think things have been dealt with by and large pretty well. And I thank you all for your efforts, and hope you have a good break over Christmas and New Year. And thank you all, and look forward to seeing you again on January the 11th.